As I speak these words, Marvel Studios is 17 years and around 50 projects, depending on how you count them, into the MCU, the cinematic franchise that started with Iron Man in 2008. It's going okay.
I am Iron Man.
Avengers!
The latest installment, Captain America Brave New World, is a sequel to both the beloved Chris Evans Captain America trilogy and the Disney Plus show The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which saw Steve Rogers' successor Sam Wilson take up the Captain America mantle for the first time. This new movie's also a bunch of hot dookie, to use the technical term. A lot of you probably aren't surprised at that, whether it's in the context of superhero fatigue or slop content, or sometimes badly disguised racism even. The idea that Marvel's flagship series isn't what it once was is practically ever present in the year 2025. And while no, it's not because of woke, I will say that even as someone who's enjoyed a lot of the post-Avengers Endgame output, fuck you, Eternals rocks, I do agree that there are some ways in which the franchise feels different these days. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, and sometimes just kind of emptier. And whatever else Brave New World might be, it is, I think, a great microcosm of these developing MCU emptinesses. In this video then, I want to discuss 3 interrelated but ultimately separate types of meaninglessness, types which, while perhaps expressed most clearly in Brave New World specifically, are existing and maybe intensifying on a wider scale. It isn't necessarily that Brave New World is uniquely bad, it doesn't touch something like the Secret Invasion Disney Plus show on that front, I don't think, and I won't even argue that all of these types of meaninglessness are individually at their worst in this latest film. That may be the case, it's just not the point I'm looking to make in this video. But I do think that no other MCU project shows us so many different types of meaninglessness together so clearly, and that, as a result, Brave New World affords us a valuable opportunity for analysis. So, spoiler warning, I guess? Anyway, let's analyze.
When Captain America throws his mighty shield, all those who chose to oppose his shield must yield. If he's led to a fight and a duel is due, then the red and the white and the blue will come through when Captain America throws his mighty shield.
The most straightforward type of meaninglessness in Brave New World is also the most obvious. The film's just kind of a mess to watch. I'll explain what I'm getting at here by zooming into one characteristic example. Let's talk about the final showdown. Captain America versus Red Hulk, Sam Wilson versus President Ross. Why does this fight happen? Well, Ross gets a motivation pass, I guess, on account of being turned into a giant rage monster, but what about Sam? Up to this point, the major factor driving Sam to uncover the leader's conspiracy is the fact that his friend slash mentor slash secret Captain America from the 50s whose life was ruined by the US government, Isaiah Bradley, is facing the death sentence for his unwitting role in the White House shooting. I must say I'm not quite sure how I feel about the film bringing Isaiah back in order to lock him up, to wring sympathy and the appearance of some statement out of the image of a black hero in chains, only to refuse engagement with any of the character's real and meaningful baggage and to defang his previous entirely justified opposition to the US state. Wait, did I say I wasn't sure how I felt about it? Sorry, I misspoke. It blows. Anyway, saving Isaiah is the main motivation for Sam throughout the piece, and generally it's effective. But by the point Ross hulks out, that presumably is accomplished. Whether or not he goes sicko mode on Washington DC, the plot is more or less exposed by this point. That's what the press conference was about. There's never a conversation establishing that Sam needs to beat Ross or talk him down quickly to get him to fess up and exonerate Isaiah. Beside this, the obvious suggestion is that Sam's just trying to subdue Ross before he hurts a bunch of people. But Sam's main motivation being the prevention of collateral damage doesn't super scan if he's weaving away backup. There's probably not footage for that I can get yet, but it happens. And more to the point, the impact of a leader's reckless conduct on the world around him isn't even an idea that's been developed much by this point. Certainly not in comparison to the one thing the film has focused on, Sam's conviction that Ross doesn't have to be a dick, can do better as a person, and that trying to push that journey would be best for the country. Which comes across fairly naive given all the kind of bad choices we've seen Ross make in this film and previously without the leader's direct manipulation, and tangent also kind of undercuts the ideals of justice and accountability Sam had previously stood for, right? Talking to Entertainment Weekly last year, Nate Moore, one of the film's producers, suggested that Sam's arc here takes cues from the Secret Empire comic book, and is thus about a guy who believes an ideal, realizing that ideal is not always held up to the same standards by other people, and feeling really betrayed about where the American government had gone. As an outline, that broadly fits a lot of Captain America stories, even a lot in the MCU. Sam or Steve feel betrayed about what the powers that be are doing with that power, with their symbols, and attempt to fix things from their perspective. But significantly, Moore's phrasing stops a little short, doesn't it? No mention of that effort to right the ship, of what's represented by Sam's do better speech, flawed and limited as that moment is, or by Steve's insistence that S.H.I.E.L.D. dismantle its infrastructure of overreach. Moore's phrasing stops at the internal, the feeling of betrayal. And that's appropriate, because that's really the furthest Brave New World allows the character to go. Has him feel conflicted and then play defense for America's image to protect the country's spirit, all the same. In what amounts to a curious and honestly cowardly backtracking from Sam's role in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. In that series, Sam was similarly concerned with America's image, but held that it could only produce good, was only worth being protected if it lived up to its promise. Anyway, tangent over. We'll return to this walking back of Sam's values later on in the video, but for now, setting aside concerns of ideology and continuity alike, these, the final stakes of the movie, are just not particularly wide. No future is being decided here. Our characters aren't fighting for different, brave new visions of their world. Perish the thought. They are primarily personal. In this sense, the film invites comparison to two of its predecessors, Captain America: The Winter Soldier and Civil War, both of which feature final climaxes where other Cap fights friends turned irrational violence monsters he's personally connected to, in the hopes that he can spark recognition and reconciliation on the basis of that personal connection's strength. But there are, of course, key differences. For one, both of those personal struggles do go hand in hand with something wider. The fate of the world is at stake in Winter Soldier. Steve and Bucky's fight is what decides whether or not the techno-fascists who infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. will gain control. And the personal stakes play into that nicely too. Hydra's goal of cold, algorithmic, violent control isn't just physically stopped, it's shown to be wrong on its face by the way friendship and brotherhood overcome Hydra programming in Bucky.
Because I'm with you to the end of the line.
Similarly, if rage wins in Civil War, Zemo is right about superheroes. But it doesn't. It also bears pointing out that compared to the bond established between Steve and Bucky or Steve and Tony, Sam and Ross have far less of a connection, one that doesn't really feel strong enough to hang the film's climax from. They weren't ever close, they never got along, and for the past 2 hours we've watched Sam begrudgingly try to first protect Ross and then stop him. But sure, the climax is them fighting, and eventually Sam is able to talk Ross down, so kind of like in those other films, Cap's victory proves his point. Ross is a big enough man, a good enough president to immediately step down for all those cowardly choices and all that bad presidenting. So not only are the what and the why of this final showdown somewhat opaque, they're also, in the context of this film and indeed this franchise, just pretty weak. The journey these characters have taken in this film and before it didn't take us to a place where this punch-up at this point means much to the viewer at all. It feels as though the only reason we do this to cap off that is that they already did the previs. Insider released a very interesting video a few years back that you've all watched already, detailing the deep partnership Marvel Studios has developed with pre-visualization studio The Third Floor to essentially 3D storyboard their films out in advance, particularly their action sequences. The video notes that not only do these sequences often get produced before a director signs on, sometimes they're even developed before a script gets finished. Now, to be clear, pre-visualization is a very cool and widely used process. It takes a lot of skill, and the use of it in a movie or show in no way lessens its worth or authenticity, but at the same time, there is a reason the storyboard typically comes after the script. Preparing blueprints for scenes before you know how those scenes will or won't fit into your characters' journeys, what the stakes will be, probably isn't the most direct route to a coherent and legible story. So, given that this film's script was being written and rewritten from at least as far back as 2021 to as recently as 2024, Falcon and the Winter Soldier writers Malcolm Spellman and Dalen Musson were originally announced to be writing the script, but we've also heard since that Rob Edwards was the screenplay's original writer. Then director Julius Onah signed on in 2022 and developed it further. Then the writers' strike happened and they shot a bunch of stuff before Matthew Orton was hired to write stuff for reshoots, and all the above, plus a Peter Glanz ended up getting screenplay credit. And that Onah's confirmed elements like Ross and the leader were already set near the start of that process, I think it's fair to assume that the Red Hulk fight was set in place and largely planned out years before the final version of this film's story was worked out, and remained in place even as the script grew away from it, or as reshoots and recuts muddied its significance. And the messiness is not just a matter of broad strokes plot stuff, it's visible in the film's characterization too. As we noted above, what drives our core cast is very often muddy, and it's similar when it comes to the smaller parts, the new guys too. Giancarlo Esposito's Sidewinder and Shira Haas's Ruth are curiously underdeveloped characters in the final cut, presumably owing to their characters reportedly being heavily changed or added wholesale during reshoots. Watching Brave New World is watching a progression of good to okay action and dialogue sequences, whose relationship to each other, or to the characters constituting them, feels strained and cloudy. This first type of meaninglessness is a local meaninglessness then. Again, it's one movie being kind of a mess to watch. Or less glibly, it's a generalized incoherence and weightlessness that impedes a viewer's effort to connect with, enjoy, get something out of a film. It's a weakness in or a disconnect between the writing, the editing, and direction, and to again enter speculative territory, it's probably caused or at least exacerbated by the Marvel Studios process, heavy top-down involvement above the traditionally key creative voices and sometimes before they've even been hired or have been able to make their mark. And a reliance which often seems to teeter towards over-reliance on rewrites and reshoots of coherence sought in retrospect. And I don't mean to say that this process has never produced good movies, or even that it can't still, but I will say that it does seem like a low redundancy system, something that works great if the script is good and the creatives have enough time and the larger industry context is stable, but which breaks down and breaks down quickly the moment any spanners enter the works. Anyway, this local meaninglessness is the most common of our types, but it's also the most subjective, and I think the least interesting. So let's move on and consider a new, global difficulty, not in reading or connecting with the things that happen in this world, but a difficulty with that world itself, and its fraught relationship with our own. Brave New World, the 1932 novel by Aldous Huxley, which lends this sequel its name, is set 500 years in the future, on an Earth controlled by the so-called World State, whose control over the population is effected not through brutality, but through other means: biological engineering, mental conditioning, and especially pleasure. The masses are plied with disposable consumer goods and with the narcotic soma. Films are no longer simply movies or talkies, but are now hyper-stimulating feelies, and a socially enforced, almost orgiastic culture of hypersexuality takes up a lot of the rest of everyone's time. We largely follow John, though, a so-called savage from a reservation outside of world-state culture, raised in a society reminiscent of the Pueblo peoples, reading nothing but a complete works of Shakespeare, which, like most pre-world state art, is contraband outside the reservation. John becomes an outcast and enters the world state, is paraded around this brave new world as something like a circus exhibit, but the novelty never wears off. That world is unable to understand John, and vice versa. The novel ends as the gaps between these realities are revealed to be unbridgeable. John's attempts to connect with this society fail, then his attempts to distance himself from it do too. The world state's superficial, hedonic, unchanging wasteland is simply unreadable to him. Meaningless. Captain America Brave New World is a political thriller where politics is having stern FaceTime calls with other politicians, and the sterner your persona, the more politics it is. By this point, many have noted that there is no message here. The almost impressive way the movie about the angry red president threatening to destroy the White House and the current world order, the one that came out a few weeks after a certain meme coin huckster was inaugurated a second time, fails to say anything about the world it released into, about the age of Trump 2.0. And that is true. As we touched on above, the film very conspicuously saps these characters and plot points of whatever limited political resonance earlier installments or source materials found and used in them. Moreover, the very broad moral or social gesturing Brave New World does partake in, the nation should come together, war is bad, African Americans have a rough time at the hands of cops sometimes, but the problem isn't with the cops or with a society that racializes them from birth or anything systemic, it's a scary green guy with a big head. All that also fails to land for a different reason, I think. This being that the America, the world of the film, is now so divorced from the reality we're living in that even shallow commentary loses its grounding. Now, I'm not the first person to raise that point, and this isn't even the first time I've discussed this general idea on my channel, but I do think Brave New World marks the point at which it's become utterly impossible to ignore, both in terms of the distance this reality drift has now reached, and of this film's specific choices. To look at this film's world is to peer through a funhouse mirror. We open with a multilingual Captain America operating in a Latin American country's airspace in a respectful and cooperative manner. We see multiple scenes of US allied countries threatening Ross. America's allies and their self-interest, their desire to secure mineral rights, are the ones destabilizing peace. The US president's head of security is a mysterious Israeli ex-spy, the MCU version of Sabra. For the uninitiated, the Mossad's answer to Captain America, who the film initially frames as a shady, self-interested figure able to wield an undue amount of influence, before revealing, no, she's super cool actually, doesn't hold any real sway with Ross, and has the best interests of the whole world at heart. Or my personal favorite, one major conflict in the film is a sovereignty dispute between the US and a major regional power over newly emerging landmasses off the coast of Asia, a dispute which leads to a naval buildup and the threat of war. And it's Japan, one of the US's closest allies. Finally, at the end of the film, the president has a public, destructive, violent outburst and is forced to step down. Call it checks and balances, call it a now outmoded decency politics, call it simply actions having consequences, call it whatever you like. It is obtrusively disconnected with a reality in which our actually existing US president shoots the proverbial Fifth Avenue man every couple of days. In 2025, this is not a political thriller, it's a political farce. But that does raise the question, how much of that is on the film? The idea that Marvel just kinda got unlucky with this one isn't hard to find. In February, a Vulture article by Chris Lee discussed the film's apparently tenser than expected reshoot process, citing an anonymous Brave New World crew member as saying,
"It's like all these things that were not predicted when Captain America 4 was given the production green light were coming to fruition. Trump, the war in Gaza, the tension in America right now." And
in one way, Vulture's source is making a valid point, right? There is only so far we can hold this new Trumpian context against the film. They're not wrong to remind us that the thing's been in development for a while, that certain choices which aren't landing great to the viewer of 2025 may have been made years and years back. But to me, the point that seems worth making isn't that Brave New World means nothing in a Trump premiership. It's that it wouldn't have meant anything under a Biden premiership, or, in the Brat timeline either. Sure, it wouldn't have been quite so farcical, some of those funhouse mirror reflections would not have stood out to the same degree, but others still would have, right? The imperialist exceptionalism on display in Brave New World's unthinking affirmation of America's right to set the terms of access to a mineral in the Indian Ocean is no doubt brought out by the Trump administration's headline-grabbing attempts at shaking down Ukraine for the war-torn country's mineral rights, but this is most assuredly not the first time the US has leaned on a weaker nation for resources, right? This is a very current, very over-determined example, but I think one more notable for its openness, the way the bullying is the point, than for its novelty. Similarly, there may not have been a, quote, war in Gaza. I think the phrase Vulture's source was looking for there was full-scale genocide when the film's production began, but obviously, history did not begin on October the 7th. The conflict was still ongoing back then, as it had been for like a century prior. Yes, at minimum, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed by Israel since the Hamas terror attack, but even counting data from this century alone, tens of thousands of Palestinians had been killed prior also. Sure, those figures include combatants, and Gaza is governed by Hamas, so that'll probably get hand-waved away by some viewers, the ones that believe in collective punishment. So how about the fact that per Save the Children, 2022, supposedly peacetime, remember, was the deadliest year for West Bank Palestinian children in a decade and a half. By November of that year, the death toll at the hands of Israeli forces was 34. Again, that's just kids in the area of the country that Hamas does not run. And hey, update, despite it only being March, and despite the so-called ceasefire they keep breaking, Israel's already about halfway to that count for 2025. And hey, update to the update, since I wrote that part, Israel has unilaterally broken that ceasefire for good in a series of midnight airstrikes that made the 18th of March the deadliest single day for Gazan children to date, killing hundreds more. The Israeli state is an engine of genocide. Sorry, getting off track. The point is that adapting the Mossad Captain America was just as questionable a choice a few years back as it is now. The point is that the film's choices and the logic underpinning the piece feel out of step with more than a handful of specific, unpredictable developments that have flummoxed the world since Brave New World's production began. The point is that these more obvious sites of disconnection speak to a larger trend that's seen the MCU unplug more and more from the Earth we watch it on. Look, yes, we are talking about a fictional setting where Norse gods and robots fight each other, but in the past, Marvel has prided itself on being the world outside your window, of maintaining the link between the reader's world and the characters more than the competition. That is a comics thing primarily, but not entirely. Retrospect tends to paint the MCU as an immediate step away from the super grounded, black leather style of early superhero cinema, but initially there was a lot of continuity there. Early on, gods are aliens, magic is science, and more to the point, there was an Afghanistan war. There was a superhero movie which couched itself in that very real, very evil thing, and not for nothing, which condemned the military-industrial complex's profiteering and the way US business interests manufacture and maintain conflict overseas. This, the world outside your windowness of the MCU, has fallen away as the years have passed, but in more and in deeper ways than the ones which most point to: tone shifts, color palettes, suit designs, and so on. Yes, there was an Afghanistan war in this world, but can you imagine the MCU representing or acknowledging Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Me neither. Oh shit, wait, but someone did imagine that, right? Back at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Twitter user @enjoyer_Delaney composed a now infamous thread imagining how the Avengers would react. The user has since been suspended from Twitter, but the thread's contents have been archived by others, so I can still show you excerpts.
Captain America. Don't worry, guys. I've seen these Russians before. I've seen Stalin. Putin doesn't stand a chance. Throws shield at Russian soldier, snapping his spine.
This is followed by the thunderous Ibam Bay chant as tens of thousands of Wakandans converge on the Ukrainian border.
Hulk destroy Putin!
He yells, running right through the Kremlin wall. As Putin tries to flee, he picks up Putin by his shirt collar.
Yeah, people didn't have a good reaction to that thread, nor to the similar January 6th one. The application of fanfic aesthetics to terrifying and brutal realities. Over 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed by Russia since 2022 was, I think it's fair to say, a viscerally insensitive thing to read. But I don't think threads like this provoked a negative reaction solely due to the way they were written. Part of what people were responding to was surely the deeper mismatch here, the feeling of incongruity, the tacit understanding we've all picked up somewhere between 2008 and now that what may once have been a world roughly parallel to the one outside our window had diverged. And we only have to look back to everyone's favorite project, Secret Invasion, to see this isn't just a feeling. Reportedly, elements of the show's original script did have something to do with a Russian invasion of Ukraine before, yes, that actually happened, and Marvel retooled the project, in part to get away from this plot point. Admittedly, the scooper responsible for that leak, Daniel RPK, has a mixed record of report accuracy, but he has leaked legitimate details before, and it does line up with what we know about Secret Invasion's complex and comprehensive rewrite-reshoot schedule from other sources. Also, it lines up with the fact that the politics, and geopolitics specifically, of the final version were fucking wackadoodle, and did feel inconsistent even within that 6-episode run. The MCU is no longer the world outside our window, if indeed it ever was. We can attribute this to internal novelties like the Adamantium Island, but only to a degree. After all, it's been a running critique for the last decade how little the franchise's gestures of change ever matter in a wider sense. Half the population disappearing for 5 years barely changed anything. The greater part of this disconnection comes down to the franchise refusing to acknowledge or depict any of the ways in which reality has moved on from the staple-ish snapshot it started with, taken from Hollywood at a time that could still pass for a Fukuyaman end of history if you weren't paying attention. Sure, there'd be a recession, but the bailouts fixed that, right? Sure, the US might be fighting a problematic war, but only because nasty individuals misled the good guys. And there's always another electoral moral rebirth ready to cancel that bad juju out. The 2 decades since that snapshot's taking have seen this franchise generally ignore any breaks with normality. Normality here being defined by the collective unconscious of this universe's generally American, generally comfortable writers and producers, and as a result, there's a sense in which it's still 2008 in the MCU, socially, politically, if not chronologically. The franchise exists in a frozen, daydream state where the problems of neoliberal technocracy bubble away below the surface, presenting as bugs rather than features, where those problems haven't developed and won't into the algorithmically enhanced permacrisis that we now see always lay a little further down that track. This may have some wider ramifications for the MCU's relationship with realism and our ability to understand it, which we'll discuss later on in the video, but for now, let's get back to the obvious one. The norms and assumptions these films' characters, arcs, and plot points exist in relation to, for instance, the credible fiction of a rules-based international order, do not exist for us in the way they do for the MCU's inhabitants. I should clarify that there's no problem with a film world simply having a different set of values or principles or stakes even to those of its target audience. Most of the time, this is no obstacle to readability, to meaning, because the film knows its setting is going to seem alien, and is able to make allowances for this, for instance, orienting a story or arc around shared elements, or consciously walking the audience through the unfamiliar norms and expectations the setting and its inhabitants understand, but we do not. That does get more complicated when a film world or franchise world starts nearer, then gradually drifts out of phase with our own, but obviously there are plenty of examples of this working just fine. Mad Max or 28 Blanks Later are the first that spring to mind. The distance between our world and theirs grows with just about every installment, but again, so long as the scripts are aware of that drift, accounting for it isn't a huge deal. We could even look to the MCU here for positive examples. Consider the thematic garb Infinity War and Endgame decked Thanos out in, the resource scarcity concerns, and the savior complex that hid behind them. Dialing up this loose eco-fascist metaphor to a galactic scale allowed the film's inconceivably large stakes to feel relevant and timely. Sure, on a literal level, there is no MCU climate crisis, Tony Stark invented free energy like a decade ago or whatever, but the sudden appearance of this would-be Malthusian demigod allows our concerns to remain relevant, even to a world that's moved beyond them. We might also consider the way the then ludicrous idea of a crypto-fascist takeover of the international security apparatus materialized in Winter Soldier, contemporary fears of data control. Arguably, there's even some of this in Secret Invasion, as a video I made a couple of years back attempted to point out. Done right, targeted heightenedness can paradoxically anchor a story's themes to reality, cast a bridge of meaning between Titan and Earth, as it were, can counteract the weakened readability of a less grounded premise, a drifting reality even. When a story or franchise assumes a sharedness though, and continues to work with it in mind even as that shared basis fades or ceases to exist, that's when things get dicey. Because what you might end up with then is a film selling itself as a political thriller that attempts to refer, to draw significance from, and bounce its meaning off of solid fixed points, without realizing those points have moved. Our second type of meaninglessness then, which we might term a global meaninglessness, arises from a fictional world still decking itself out in the trappings of reality, groundedness, and which used to run more or less parallel to our own, but which has long since diverged, which now runs almost perpendicular. It's an Earth less able to link back to viewer lived experience through reality anchoring metaphor, and perhaps less willing. Comic book writer and novelist G. Willow Wilson, notably the creator of Ms. Marvel, wrote a Blue Sky thread in February discussing the increasing popularity of the whole villain with a point archetype, which I think it's worth quoting at length.
If it's easier to write relatable villains than relatable good guys, that means something and should be considered as an independent question. Why have villains become so popular in recent decades? Because they reflect people's lived experiences with a broken system. Conversely, why have good guys become so cringe, so unrelatable, so one note? Because good guys are historically portrayed as rule followers, law abiders, both sidesers. For the last few decades, that means that the good guys end up defending the same broken system that produces the villains. If you want to write heroes in the year 2025, you have to decide what they stand for and then stand for it. The mealy-mouthed, offend-no-one approach no longer works. People respond to the Walter Whites because you can put truth in their mouths. So put truth in the mouths of the good guys. This is easier said than done, by the way, because the default position in US culture is still that a hero is someone who doesn't offend anybody, who isn't political, and whose ideals are conveniently abstract.
More and more then, to tell a superhero story that feels relevant to our own lives is to take a specific stand and make a specific point, is inherently a potentially divisive act. In part 1, I suggested that from an outside perspective, the key points of the Marvel machinery seem to be heavy and early studio involvement, and the locking in of a project's vision retrospectively, movies made in the edit bay or in the reshoots. But increasingly, there is another prong we'd be remiss to leave out, a hyper-awareness of fandom narratives and audience expectations. Variety reported last year that a number of companies, including Disney, had started integrating superfan focus groups into their production and marketing processes, changing promotional materials and, in some cases, the texts themselves to try and avoid backlash. And that's the final element of this particular meaninglessness. At the risk of sounding like one of those Blazing Saddles guys, Marvel wouldn't make a movie about unelected Nazi saboteurs taking over the government today, because that's basically fucking happened now, and acknowledging it has somehow become a controversial partisan act, one Marvel is currently far too risk-averse to even consider undertaking. The coincidence of a rightward-veering Overton window and the now almost normalized mass targeting of any property that falls afoul of the culture war's fascistic vanguard, alongside the MCU's infinite money glitch starting to fail, is surely another factor in this drift effect's intensification, and in its intensifying lack of recognition. The company that made Iron Man could tell a story about a real war really being orchestrated in part by Western business interests without having to worry about pissing off half the general audience because A, Marvel wasn't then relying on universal appeal, didn't need everyone and their dog to see the thing twice to break even, and B, let's be honest, that half had a good deal fewer worms in their brains back then, hadn't yet tied their own identities so firmly to hegemonic power structures, didn't yet experience warmonger bad as sinister leftist assault on them personally. But fast forward through 15 years, and just as importantly through several $1 billion, and what do you get? Japan playing the China role here to ensure Brave New World can flop in Shanghai as well as LA, and Sam and Isaiah having their political commitments walked back to ensure the online dipshits who are going to whine about the movie being woke anyway don't whine about the movie being woke. You get a captain for an America that has ceased to exist. But that's not the end. Because in that sense of walking back, and indeed in that sense of studio spinelessness, I think we're pointed to the last, most fundamental meaninglessness on the MCU's horizon.
My possibilities of choosing or not choosing a future depend on acts already accomplished, and they constitute the point of departure for my possible decisions.
That's a passage from Italian critic and writer Umberto Eco's 1972 article, The Myth of Superman, summing up a point from Sartrean existentialism. Basically, he's making the point that human freedom is specific, conditioned, is never abstract, that each step we take in a journey is tied inexorably to where you are and when you take that step, and to all prior steps made. And he's making the point that the same is true for characters in a story. In a sense, what a character ends up symbolizing, what their story means, is found in the build-up of all those steps, all those points in the continuum of choices made. But what of a character like Superman? For Eco, the superhero exists at the intersection of two fundamentally different storytelling types, mythic and novelistic, pre-modern and modern, static and ongoing. They're a character who exists in mortal life, who is always undertaking new actions, but who is also timeless, has set characteristics, stands for a particularity. It's a paradox. In Superman, writes Eco,
the concept of time breaks down, and the time that breaks down is the time of the story. That is, the notion of time which ties one episode to another.
What's created is a kind of oniric climate, where what has happened before and what has happened after appears extremely hazy. Hearing those words 5 decades on, you might recognize what Eco's describing as the sliding timescale, and making such a big deal out of something that's come to make sense intuitively might seem odd. But even now, the results Eco observed remain. Time isn't not broken down, we simply read around that breakdown. This allows books to run for years, decades, while maintaining a status quo. But there are consequences to this. Eco, for instance, worries one might be the forgetting or de-emphasizing in the reader's consciousness of the existence of the entire human community whose progressiveness is based on making plans. But I don't think we have to get so grandiose. On a far more basic level, if a character is always developing, they kind of never are too, right? A meaning is created, but it's always somewhat provisional. In theory, this is one of the things that's attractive about the prospect of comic book adaptation. A version of the story can become set, meaning can become stable. And even with an ongoing cinematic universe like the MCU, much of this is preserved. The story might never totally settle, the meaning might be a rolling thing, might always be becoming, the structure is more novelistic than mythic in Eco's terms, but the actors still age, so time must pass. And at any given point, you can look backwards to see solidity, see the gradual concretion of potentiality. And personally, the way Marvel have outdone the shaky continuity of earlier proto-universes, have stepped up and maintained that process across dozens of individual films and shows, is one of the biggest reasons I've stayed interested in the MCU project, continue to, on a good day, find it meaningful. This is not Eco's oniric climate. This is not a sliding timescale. There exists a continuum of choices made, of events occurred. For Hungarian theorist and philosopher George Lukács, this is the bedrock of realism. And you might be thinking this is a little late to be introducing new thinkers into the video, but in the words of brainwashed Bart from The Simpsons Hit and Run, kiss my grits. Because realism is important here. Up to this point in the video, when considering how realistic, how near our own experience this franchise is, we've talked about groundedness versus heightenedness. In other words, we've talked about naturalism. We could consider naturalism the physical dimension of this question. What kind of beating can the human body take? Did godly space beings from Asgard visit the ancient Norse? Could this technology semi-feasibly exist? And so on. Realism, in this sense, would perhaps be the spiritual counterpart. Does this development follow? Does this choice track? Or we could consider it the temporal element. Is there a clear thread that ties material and mental history, acts already accomplished, to the chosen future? In his book The Meaning of Contemporary Realism, Lukács writes that a correct aesthetic understanding of social and historical reality is the precondition of realism. For the Hungarian, it was in the interaction of character and environment that the concrete potentiality of a particular individual gets singled out from the bad infinity of purely abstract potentialities. What's being imagined here is basically the literary materialist equivalent of the existentialism eco-superman essay draws on. That continuum, linking past acts and future choices. So, a cancer-stricken Jane Foster becoming the god of thunder to escape her sickness is not an example of naturalism, but so long as her psychology, her prior choices, and her material conditions contribute to her further story, then it is still an example of realism. Generally, even as the MCU has leaned further and further away from naturalism, this type of realism has remained important. This is the main reason we don't like those subsequently abandoned MCU status quo changes. Like I suggested above, it's not even because they take us away from our world, it's because they don't. Not enough. It's because they try to split the difference, change the world in one film and have it all but revert back in the next. That lack of follow-through is the world's realist continuum breaking down. Aside from wobbles like that though, and especially on a character level, the MCU has largely recognized the importance of maintaining this sense of realism. It's a big part of why people like the franchise as much as they do. Following characters step by step over years, decades of appearances and developments that track with both the world they're in and what's happened to them before is satisfying, is meaningful. Because even if the MCU has drifted away from our own world, our own realist continuum, even if that gives rise to a kind of meaninglessness, it has its own, more or less. For now. 2 years ago, Joanna Robinson, author of MCU: The Reign of Marvel Studios, suggested Kevin Feige had made comments about the upcoming 6th Avengers film, Secret Wars, indicating some sort of soft reboot would follow. Variety was the first major outlet to report further information. And while the big Crisis at Marvel article penned by Tatiana Siegel relied on undisclosed insider sources who may have had their own agendas to push, as I pointed out in a video nearer the time, one of those sources did mention that the concerned studio was considering bringing the original, half-dead Avengers lineup back, and increasingly that some type of continuity reset is on the cards has been corroborated. Just recently, for instance, the Russo brothers talked about Secret Wars as a beginning, not an end. Now, I am referring to this as a reset, not a reboot, going from comments made by TV head honcho Brad Winterbaum and also common sense. It seems unlikely this new era will see every character, every story start from scratch, so I think the softer term makes sense to use, but honestly, we don't really know. So whether it's a case of smashing a few universes together, whether we stick with the generally recognizable MCU in which ex-Fox characters like the X-Men and the Fantastic Four end up always having been present, or whether, as has been rumored, they go the whole hog and bring back classic recipe Iron Man, Captain America, and Black Widow 2, what this reset will look like in practice remains to be seen. In one form or another though, it does look to be on the horizon. We talked a while back about the ways that the studio's risk aversion might be contributing to some of these Marvel meaninglessnesses, but I think this, the rumored post-Secret Wars continuity adjustment, is surely the ultimate expression of this principle. That back to the hits, reunite the classic Avengers, Robert Downey Jr. 100 years, forever energy that seems to have gripped the MCU's architects since that post-Endgame wobble caught them unawares and the limits of that previously enjoyed infinite money glitch became apparent. Now, there is a logic here. This type of reset would undoubtedly create a space for throwing out safer and easier box office hits. Iron Man Again would probably have a bigger opening weekend than Eternals 2 or Black Knight 1, but the result of this would be the plunging of this franchise into the very sort of hazy oniric climate Eco's article discussed, would surely see that still fascinating Lukácsian continuum ruptured. The realism of this franchise would take an irreversible hit, and we might be seeing the early warning signs of this already. YouTuber Nando of the channel Nando v Movies has a couple of videos looking at Brave New World on his channel The Nando Cut, and one point he makes is that the film's post-credit scene feels an odd fit.
Post-credit scene also very bad. This also felt like something that was shot yesterday. I don't remember what it is, but Sam says something to Stearns, it's like, what do you know, Stearns? And Stearns is like, you think you're the only heroes and you think you're the only world, but I've done the probabilities and we got lots of worlds and they're all gonna hit and do Secret Wars. And I don't care. I care about that. I think that will be a fun movie, but like, I don't need him to tell me that. It seems like originally this was going to be a pitch towards like a World War Hulk thing, where it was like, oh, I've put some things in motion you won't even understand, and I gave the little podcast boy, I gave him Hulk powers too, and now there's maybe a red She-Hulk running around, maybe, who knows. And I guess that would have been cool. I guess I did not need another character to talk about multiverse stuff. Not that I'm against it, but it just did not feel like the direction this movie was going in.
Looking at the reshoot information we've been given, the idea that the leader's multiverse tease was a late alteration, was a pivot, might have legs. The scene, or at least this version of the scene, was reportedly a part of that last round of filming. Again, this is a film that very obtrusively brings this franchise's long-dormant Hulk elements back into play. A film that was in production as Scar and Abomination similarly careened back into the picture. And the stinger swerves away from that, is a tease for a film that didn't really exist until a year ago. Years back, I made a video arguing that, contrary to what a lot of people were saying, Phase 4, that is, the immediate post-Endgame years, did have a focus. That focus being expansion. New characters, new arenas, new genres, new types of world building, new types of meaning. Trying on a bunch of hats to see what fit best, and to ensure the next 10 years of hat weather had enough wardrobe options. A strategy like that was never going to have an immediate payoff, but if committed to in time, this set of fresh storytelling avenues could lead to something great. But if what we're seeing now is a studio pivot, if the perceived need to reset means this universe's threads are being drawn together prematurely, then not only is an end in sight, but even before that, as we perhaps see in that odd-fitting post-credit stinger, a whole set of new beginnings are being denied continuation. But it's not even just the reset, is it? Yes, the prospect of and early preparations for a post-Secret Wars reset is the ultimate expression of Marvel Studios' current risk-averse, streamlining over realism desire, but that is not to say it's the only expression. Indeed, we can perhaps see another, smaller-scale instance of this in Brave New World. That Nando Cut video, yes, I know, holy shit pillar, watch another YouTuber, also notes the strange way Sam is yanked out of his previous Louisiana money trouble boat repairing life, the way Brave New World warps him from a specific being in a specific community to existing in a generic, placeless super lair.
He also has some sort of Captain America office now, but he is not part of the government, and he doesn't run the Avengers. So what is he doing? Why does he have enough money to just open a little door and a brand new suit comes out and he's like, oh, I should put this suit on? What happened between these two movies that completely changed this part of the character? Because when you take away the working man, when you take away his family, when you take away like his shrimp boat or whatever he was trying to fix up back in the Fatwa show, Like, he's just a guy in like a fancy room with computers and his one friend, but I don't think that's interesting. I think the idea that this Captain America has more normal guy concerns is interesting, and he just like doesn't have those anymore.
We've talked plenty about the way Sam seems to be in a different place philosophically, politically in this film compared to where he left off in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. We've speculated that this walk back happened in order to allow a more straightforward, less challenging story to be told in this movie. And the fact that he's also in another place literally, materially, is the other side of the coin, right? If Sam has to retrieve adamantium and uncover White House plots without any institutional support or a room full of gear, the movie potentially gets more interesting, potentially gets more meaningful. Something would necessarily be said about the contrast between Sam's conditions, his background, and his new role. But it also gets a little baggier, a little less accessible, and maybe even a little more divisive. And we can't have that, can we? So, yes, a series-wide continuity reset will rip the MCU's realist continuum up at the roots, send the franchise wholesale into Eco's oniric climate of hazy meaning, but that destruction is prefigured in miniature every time a character's complexities get rolled back, every time a rusty boat becomes a glossy mission HQ, every time acts already accomplished cease to be the points of departure for future steps. This impending rupture then, together with the anticipations of it we see in a project like Brave New World, the micro-adjustments to snip off budding storylines or to simplify potentially thorny elements in the meantime, these constitute our third type of meaninglessness, a universal meaninglessness. Universal because this isn't about one movie, one story being a mess. This isn't about a world drifting out of phase. This is about the basic building blocks of existence separating, about time breaking down, and because what is this, if not the disintegration of the U in MCU, the disintegration of the realist continuum that makes this series of films and shows a cinematic universe? I don't want you to think this is an MCU bad video. The myth of Superman ends with Umberto Eco emphasizing the immobilizing metaphysics underlying the 20th century superhero's kind of conceptual plot. In practice, the sliding timescale solution relegated Superman to fighting extreme non-naturalistic evils, aliens, supervillains, gods, or petty crooks. In other words, the only real crime consistently recognized was crime against private property. If Superman uses his strength to directly affect good rather than treating the symptoms of an invisible, pervasive moral evil, the status quo changes, choices and acts get locked in, Superman's existence progresses irreversibly, and the story consumes itself. Superman must make virtue consist of many little activities on a small scale, Eco writes, never achieving a total awareness. What I suggested earlier about the MCU, that the aging of actors, the expiry of their contracts, forces the cinematic franchise to avoid the problems of realism Eco identified in Superman, is true, but there are more problems than problems of realism. Regardless of its gradual, progressive concretion of potentiality, the fact that, so far at least, things happen and generally stay happened, too often, the franchise's determination to never take anything off the table, to keep its world in a naturalistic limbo, semi-recognizable, semi-meaningless, means many of Eco's closing charges apply unnervingly well here too. But to note this isn't necessarily to condemn the series. See, here's the thing, that delaying, that limbo has been the backdrop to good stories, to meaningful films and shows. In some cases, Wakanda Forever springs to mind, in many ways a mirror version of Brave New World, the thoughtful application of a targeted heightenedness has turned that naturalistic limbo into a weapon for meaning. Because ultimately, every type of conceptual plot, every storytelling setup offers different varieties of meaning and equally different varieties of meaninglessness. So again, I don't want you to think this is an MCU bad video. There is no MCU that is wholly bad or wholly good. There is no MCU whose meaning is not in some way problematic. I want you to think of this video as a sketch. At present, these are the choices Marvel seem to be making, and these, as I see them, are those choices' results. But that seeing is subjective, obviously. How much, if at all, these three types of meaninglessness matter will vary from viewer to viewer. And even if the impact of one or all of these types does appear to be intensifying, that's not to say those trends are not reversible, especially if projects figure out new ways around them, or if Marvel gets less risk-averse, less dead set on the safest, most boring path forward. You don't have to choose between making a War Machine movie or remaking Avengers 1. You can make Shang-Chi 2, you know? It's probably worth noting that the Thunderbolts trailers seem to be establishing a link between super career burnout and the regular variety. If the film follows through, that's targeted heightenedness, that's a reality anchor, that is meaning. And hey, I started writing this video before any episodes of the new Daredevil reboot had come out, but as I'm recording, a few have dropped, and they're really good. And some of the things that show is doing feel like counterpoints to things I've said here, feel like examples of these necessary adjustments. So I made a companion video you can watch now as a Patreon or YouTube supporter going into why Born Again rocks and how it combats the types of meaninglessness we've just been discussing. So yeah, get access to that and over 20 other exclusives alongside a ton of other perks and the knowledge that you are directly helping me fund videos like this by signing up on YouTube or Patreon today. So huge thank you to everyone doing so already, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Kwang Yu Liu, Something Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy. Bye.